The horse screamed and reared so hard that Alaric almost fell from the saddle. Something sharp had cut into its leg beneath the snow, and the animal spun in a tight, panicked circle on the narrow forest road. Alaric fought the reins with both hands, his breath coming out in white clouds, his heart hammering against his ribs. The wind had been building all morning, and now it howled through the bare trees like something alive, something angry. He finally brought the horse under control and slid down from the saddle, sinking to his knees in snow that had drifted waist-high against the old stone wall bordering his land. He expected to find a broken branch, or a shard of ice, or a fallen fence post buried beneath the white. Instead, his gloved fingers closed around something hard and flat, wrapped partly in rotted cloth, wedged between two roots as if it had been placed there on purpose and left to be forgotten. He pulled it free and brushed away the snow with the edge of his sleeve. It was a wooden frame, cracked along one corner, holding a small portrait painted in oil. The colors had faded with age, but the face inside the frame had not lost its power. A young woman looked out at him with steady, sorrowful eyes, her dark hair loosely pinned, her lips slightly parted as if she had been about to speak the moment the painter finished his work. Alaric knelt there in the snow for a long moment, forgetting the cold, forgetting his injured horse, forgetting everything except the strange and sudden feeling that this woman was trying to tell him something across a distance of time he could not yet measure. He was Duke Alaric Thornwood, master of an estate that stretched across nearly 4,000 acres of farmland, forest, and frozen river valley. He was a practical man, not given to superstition, not the sort to be moved by an old and damaged painting found buried in a snowdrift. Yet as he turned the frame over in his hands, he felt something close to dread, though he could not explain why a stranger's face should trouble him so deeply. The back of the frame was rougher than the front, the wood darkened with age and dampness. Carved faintly into the lower corner, so shallow that he almost missed it in the weak morning light, were two letters, E and V, nothing else. No date, no name of an artist, no mark of the family who might have owned it. Just those two letters, scratched perhaps by the painter or perhaps by someone else entirely, someone who had wanted to leave a trace of identity behind without giving too much away. His horse, favoring its injured leg, nudged him gently on the shoulder, as if reminding him that the wind was rising and the sky above the tree line had turned the color of iron. Alaric wrapped the portrait carefully inside his coat, mounted with some difficulty, and turned back toward Thornwood Hall, riding slower than usual to spare the animal further pain. The ride home took nearly an hour longer than expected. Snow began to fall again before he reached the gates, fine and silent, settling over the fields like a held breath. By the time he handed his horse to the stable boy and climbed the stone steps into the warmth of the great hall, his fingers were numb, and his mind was fixed entirely on the small painting hidden beneath his coat. He did not go to his study, where the fire would already be burning, and where his steward, Harold, would be waiting with the morning's correspondence. Instead, he went directly to the long gallery on the second floor, where generations of Thornwood family portraits hung in heavy gilded frames along both walls. He needed to see the woman's face again in better light, needed to know if his eyes had deceived him in the cold. They had not. Standing beneath the tall windows, with gray daylight falling across the canvas, the portrait was even more striking than it had been in the snow. The woman's eyes held a quality Alaric had rarely seen in any painting, not sadness exactly, but something closer to quiet resolve, as though she had made a difficult decision and was bracing herself to carry it out. Her clothing suggested wealth, or at least comfort, a fine dress with detailed embroidery at the collar, though the style was old enough that Alaric, who had some knowledge of fashion history from his aunt's endless lectures on the subject, guessed the painting to be at least 60 or 70 years old, perhaps older. He was still standing there, lost in thought, when Harold found him. Harold had served the Thornwood family for over 20 years, first under Alaric's father and now under Alaric himself. He was a careful, methodical man, not easily surprised, but even he raised an eyebrow at the sight of his employer standing motionless in the gallery, snow still melting from his boots onto the polished floor, holding a small and clearly damaged painting as though it were made of glass. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "is everything well? The stable boy mentioned your horse was injured." Alaric did not answer immediately. He held the portrait out toward Harold instead. "I found this on the northern boundary, buried in the snow near the old stone wall. Do you recognize her?" Harold studied the painting for a long moment, tilting his head slightly, the way he always did when trying to place a face from among the hundreds of tenants, merchants, and visitors who pass through the estate each year. Finally, he shook his head. "I cannot say I do, Your Grace. It is fine work, whoever painted it. But I have never seen this woman before, not in the village, not among any family I know of in this county." Alaric turned the frame over and showed him the carved letters. "E and V," Harold murmured. "It could be many things, a family name, a place, even a private joke between the artist and his subject. It is difficult to say without more information." Alaric set the portrait down carefully on a nearby table and rubbed his cold hands together, trying to warm them by the gallery's small fireplace. "I want to know who she was," he said finally. "Something about this feels unfinished, Harold, as though she was left behind somewhere she never meant to be." Harold's expression grew gently skeptical, the look of a practical man faced with a request he found difficult to justify. "Your Grace, if I may say so, it is likely nothing more than a lost item. A merchant's cart may have overturned on that road years ago, spilling goods into the snow that were never recovered. It happens more often than people think, especially on that stretch near the old wall, where the ground is uneven and travelers sometimes lose their footing in bad weather." "That may be true," Alaric admitted, "but I would still like to know." Over the following days, Alaric could not stop thinking about the woman in the portrait. He returned to the gallery more often than he cared to admit, studying her face as though it might eventually reveal its secrets simply through patience. He asked his household staff, one by one, whether any of them recognized her. The cook, who had lived in the county her entire life, shook her head. The gardener, whose family had worked the estate for 3 generations, offered the same answer. Even old Agnes, the housekeeper who remembered stories from her grandmother's time, had never heard of any woman with those particular initials connected to Thornwood or its surrounding villages. Alaric began to wonder if he was searching for something that did not exist, a mystery invented entirely by his own restless mind. Perhaps Harold was right. Perhaps the portrait had simply been lost by a passing traveler, dropped from a cart during a storm many years before Alaric was even born, and the strange pull he felt toward her face was nothing more than a trick of the imagination, the kind of thing that happens when a lonely man spends too much time alone in a cold and quiet house. And yet, each time he tried to set the matter aside, something drew him back. It was not merely her expression, though that alone was compelling enough. It was the placement of the portrait itself, wedged so precisely between the roots of an old tree, wrapped in cloth as though someone had once intended to protect it from the weather, only for time and snow to bury it completely. A dropped item from a passing cart would not have been wrapped so carefully. It would not have been tucked so deliberately into a hiding place. Someone had wanted this portrait to be found, or at the very least, had wanted it to survive. One evening, nearly a week after the discovery, Alaric sat alone in his study long after the rest of the household had gone to bed. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls, and the portrait rested on the desk in front of him, propped against a stack of unread letters. Outside, the wind continued its restless complaint against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a fox called out into the darkness. He found himself speaking to the painted woman, quietly, almost embarrassed by his own behavior. "Who were you?" he asked the silent canvas. "And why do I feel as though I already know you, even though we have never met?" Of course, the portrait offered no answer. But as Alaric studied her face once more in the flickering firelight, he noticed something he had missed before, something so small that it had escaped his attention in every previous examination. Along the very edge of the canvas, nearly hidden beneath the frame itself, there was a faint mark, not part of the original painting but added afterward, scratched into the surface with something sharp. It formed a rough shape, difficult to interpret at first, until Alaric realized with a jolt that it resembled the outline of a small building, perhaps a church, perhaps a chapel, with a single tall spire rising from its center. He leaned closer, his pulse quickening. It was crude, clearly not the work of a trained artist, but deliberate all the same. Someone, at some point after the painting was completed, had scratched this small symbol into the canvas, hidden where only careful examination would reveal it. Alaric sat back in his chair, his mind racing. A portrait carefully wrapped and hidden, 2 initials carved into the frame, and now, hidden within the painting itself, what appeared to be a marker, a clue, pointing toward some particular place. He did not sleep well that night. Long after he had extinguished the last candle and retreated to his bedchamber, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning the mystery over and over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by a river. He thought of the woman's steady eyes, the quiet resolve in her expression, the sense that she had been interrupted in the middle of something important. By morning, he had made his decision. He would not simply set the portrait aside as an unsolvable curiosity, nor would he accept Harold's practical explanation without at least attempting to learn more. Somewhere in some county or village he had not yet visited, someone might still remember the woman with the letters E and V. Someone might know the meaning of the small chapel scratched into the corner of her portrait. He found Harold in the breakfast room shortly after dawn, already reviewing the day's correspondence with his usual quiet efficiency. "Harold," Alaric said, "I intend to travel." Harold looked up, his expression carefully neutral, though Alaric could see the faint concern behind his steward's calm demeanor. "Travel, your grace? To where, if I may ask?" "I am not entirely certain yet," Alaric admitted, "but I believe the frame was made by a craftsman, and such work often carries the mark of its maker, even when the artist's signature is absent. I intend to begin with the framers and portrait makers in the neighboring counties. Someone, somewhere, will recognize this style of work." Harold set down his cup slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. "Your grace, forgive me, but is this truly necessary? You have estates to manage, tenants who depend on your attention, matters of far greater consequence than the identity of a woman who has likely been gone from this world for decades. Whatever story lies behind that portrait, it belongs to the past. It cannot be undone, whatever it was." Alaric considered this for a long moment, watching the pale winter light spill across the breakfast table. "Perhaps you are right," he said finally. "Perhaps there is nothing to find, and I will return in a week having wasted both time and coin on a fool's errand. But I cannot simply set this painting on a shelf and forget her face, Harold. Something tells me that if I do not search for the truth now, I never will, and the mystery will remain unsolved forever, buried as deeply as she was in that snow." Harold studied him for a moment longer, then finally nodded, recognizing the particular stubbornness that occasionally surfaced in his employer, a trait Alaric had inherited from his late father, who had been famous throughout the county for pursuing even the smallest unanswered questions, until he had wrung every possible answer from them. "Very well, your grace," Harold said. "I will make arrangements for the estate in your absence. But I would ask that you take Peter with you. The roads are treacherous this time of year, and a second set of hands and eyes would serve you well, particularly if your search leads you into unfamiliar territory." Alaric agreed readily enough. Peter was a young groundskeeper who had proven himself reliable and steady in difficult situations, and his company on the road would be welcome, both for practical reasons and simply to have someone to talk to during what promised to be a long and uncertain journey. By midday, preparations were already underway. Alaric packed only what he needed: a change of clothes, sufficient coin for lodging and information, and of course, the portrait itself, wrapped now in fresh cloth and placed carefully inside a small wooden box lined with wool to protect it from further damage. He stood once more in the long gallery before departing, looking up at the row of Thornwood ancestors staring down from their heavy frames, wondering what they would think of him chasing after a stranger's face across 3 counties in the dead of winter. Perhaps, he thought, they would understand better than anyone. Every one of those portraits told a story that had, in its own time, seemed just as urgent and just as personal as the mystery now consuming his thoughts. Stories did not stop mattering simply because time had passed. If anything, the passage of time only made them more fragile, more likely to be lost entirely, unless someone chose to chase them down before they vanished completely. As Alaric mounted his horse in the courtyard, with Peter already waiting astride his own mount and the wooden box carefully secured behind the saddle, he glanced back once at Thornwood Hall, its gray stone walls softened by the falling snow. He did not know what he would find on the road ahead, whether he would return with answers or with nothing more than the same unanswered questions he carried now. But as he turned his horse toward the county road and urged it into a steady walk, he felt, for the first time since finding the portrait, a sense of purpose rather than mere curiosity. Somewhere beyond the borders of his own land, in a village or town he had never visited, someone was waiting to tell him who the woman with the sorrowful eyes had truly been, and why her portrait had been hidden so carefully in the snow, wrapped and buried as though someone had once been desperate to keep her safe, even if it meant losing her forever. The wind picked up as they rode past the old stone wall where he had found her, and for a brief moment, Alaric could have sworn he heard something carried on the gusts, faint and distant, almost like a voice calling out from somewhere far away. Though when he turned to listen more closely, there was nothing there but snow and silence, and the long, empty road stretching out ahead of him toward the unknown. The village of Rosemere sat at the bottom of a shallow valley, its rooftops dusted white, smoke rising from every chimney in thin gray ribbons against the pale sky. Alaric and Peter arrived just as the sun began its early winter descent, the light already turning amber and long shadows stretching across the frozen road. Neither man had spoken much during the ride, the cold making conversation difficult, but Alaric had spent the hours turning over every possible explanation for the portrait, each theory more elaborate than the last, none of them satisfying. They found lodging at a modest inn near the village square, its sign creaking gently in the wind, a painted image of a running hare barely visible beneath years of weather. The innkeeper, a broad-shouldered man named William, welcomed them warmly enough, clearly pleased to have paying guests during the quiet winter months when travelers were scarce. "You have come a long way in this weather," William observed, setting 2 mugs of hot cider before them. "Business or something else?" Alaric considered how much to reveal. "We are searching for information about a portrait," he said finally. "An old one, likely made by a local craftsman many years ago. We were told there was once a renowned framer working in this village." William's expression shifted with recognition. "Ah, you must mean old Edmund. He has not worked in many years now, his hands shake too badly for fine detail, but he was indeed known throughout the county for his frames. Beautiful work carved by hand, each one different from the last. He lives just past the mill on the road toward the river. If anyone can tell you about an old frame, it would be him." The following morning, after a night of restless sleep in an unfamiliar bed, Alaric and Peter made their way toward the mill as William had directed. The path was narrow and slick with ice, bordered by leafless hedgerows that rattled faintly in the wind. They found Edmund's cottage exactly where William had described, a small stone house with smoke curling from its chimney and neatly stacked firewood along one wall. Edmund himself answered the door after several knocks, a stooped man with white hair and pale, watery eyes that nonetheless seemed sharp with attention as he studied his unexpected visitors. When Alaric explained the purpose of their visit and produced the wooden box containing the portrait, Edmund's expression grew thoughtful, and he invited them inside without hesitation. The cottage was warm and cluttered, filled with the tools of a lifetime spent working with wood, chisels and small saws hanging from pegs along the walls, sawdust still visible in the corners despite years, since Edmund had last practiced his craft with any regularity. He cleared a space on his worn wooden table and gestured for Alaric to set the box down. "Let me see what you have brought me," Edmund said, his voice carrying the rough texture of age but also genuine curiosity. Alaric lifted the portrait carefully from its wrappings and placed it on the table. Edmund leaned forward, adjusting a pair of thick spectacles perched on his nose, and studied the frame in silence for a long moment, running his fingers gently along its carved edges, tracing the pattern with the practiced familiarity of a man who had spent decades creating exactly this kind of work. "I know this frame," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "Or rather, I know the style. This joinery, this particular curve along the corners, this is not my work, but it belongs to a method I learned from my own teacher many years ago, a technique passed down through only a handful of craftsmen in this region." Alaric leaned forward eagerly. "Do you know who might have made it?" Edmund removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes, clearly searching through decades of memory. "There was a painter," he said slowly, "who traveled through several counties many years ago, perhaps 40 years now, maybe longer. He was known for making his own frames rather than commissioning them separately, which was unusual even then. Most painters left the framing to specialists like myself. But this man insisted on doing everything himself, said it gave his work a more personal quality." "Do you remember his name?" Alaric asked. Edmund shook his head slowly. "It has been too long, and my memory is not what it once was. But I do recall that he worked mostly along the coast, in the towns near Ashcombe County. He would travel from village to village, painting portraits for merchant families and minor gentry who could not afford the more famous artists working in the cities. His work was skilled, but modest, the kind of painting a comfortable family might commission for a daughter's wedding, or perhaps to mark some other important occasion." Peter, who had remained mostly silent throughout the conversation, spoke up for the first time. Would there be any way to learn his name for certain? Edmund considered this, tapping his weathered fingers against the table. "There might be," he said. "He had a daughter, if I recall correctly, who sometimes traveled with him and later took up some of his trade herself, though I believe she focused more on smaller commissions, miniatures and the like, rather than full portraits. If she is still alive, and if she remained in Ashcombe, she may remember far more than I do. She would be getting on in years herself now, but such things are often remembered clearly even when recent events fade." Alaric felt a surge of hope for the first time since leaving Thornwood Hall. "Do you know where in Ashcombe she might be found?" "I do not know precisely," Edmund admitted. "It has been many years since I heard any news of that family. But Ashcombe is not so large a county that a woman with such a distinctive trade would be difficult to locate. Ask at the harbor towns first. Painters and their families often settled near the water, where trade was steady and commissions from merchant families were more frequent." Before they departed, Edmund studied the portrait once more, his expression growing distant and thoughtful. "There is something else," he said quietly. "This frame shows signs of having been altered after it was first made. Do you see here, along the inner edge? The wood has been carefully reshaped, as though something was removed from behind the canvas at some point after the painting was completed." Alaric leaned closer, examining the area Edmund indicated. Indeed, the wood along the inner edge appeared slightly different in color and texture from the rest of the frame, as though it had been carved away and smoothed over by careful hands. "What do you think was removed?" Alaric asked. Edmund shrugged, though his eyes remained thoughtful. "It is impossible to say for certain. Sometimes people hide letters or small objects behind a portrait, particularly if the sentiment attached to the painting was a private one, something not meant for the eyes of a husband, a father, or anyone else who might disapprove. If something was hidden there once, it is long gone now. But the fact that space existed at all tells you something about the woman in that painting, or about whoever commissioned it. This was not merely decoration to them. It carried a secret." The words settled over Alaric with unexpected weight. He thanked Edmund sincerely for his time and knowledge, and the old craftsman waved off his gratitude with the modest dismissal of a man who had spent his entire life quietly perfecting a trade few people ever thought to appreciate. As they walked back toward the village, the winter sun struggling weakly through thin clouds, Peter finally broke the silence that had settled between them. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "may I ask what you hope to find at the end of all this? Even if we locate this painter's daughter, even if she remembers everything perfectly, the woman in that portrait has likely been gone from this world for many years. What do you hope to gain by learning her name? Alaric walked several steps before answering, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. I am not entirely certain, he admitted honestly. Perhaps I simply cannot bear the thought of a person disappearing so completely that not even their name survives. Everyone deserves to be remembered as something more than a mystery, Peter. Whoever she was, she lived a full life once. She had thoughts and hopes and fears just as we do now. It feels wrong to leave her as nothing more than 2 carved letters and a beautiful, sorrowful face. Peter nodded slowly, seeming to accept this answer, though Alaric could tell his young companion still harbored some doubts about the wisdom of traveling so far in pursuit of an old and possibly unsolvable mystery. That evening, back at the inn, Alaric sat alone by the fire while Peter tended to their horses in the stable. William brought him a fresh mug of cider without being asked, settling into the chair opposite with the easy familiarity of a man accustomed to keeping company with weary travelers. "You seem troubled," William observed, nodding toward the wooden box resting on the table beside Alaric's chair. Alaric considered deflecting the question, but something about the warmth of the fire and the quiet comfort of the inn loosened his usual reserve. "I found a portrait," he explained, "on my own land, buried in the snow. I have been trying to learn who the woman in the painting was and why it was left there." William's expression grew curious, and he leaned forward slightly. "May I see it?" Alaric hesitated only briefly before retrieving the portrait and setting it on the table between them. William studied the woman's face for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "She has the look of someone carrying a heavy burden," William said finally. "I have seen that expression before, though rarely painted so clearly. My own grandmother had eyes like that, near the end of her life. She had lost a great deal, you understand, over the years. War, illness, family disputes that tore relations apart long before I was born. That kind of sorrow settles into a person's face eventually, if they carry it long enough without ever setting it down." Alaric found himself unexpectedly moved by William's observation. "Do you think that is what happened to her? Some great loss?" "It is only a guess," William admitted, "but an educated one. People do not paint sorrow like that without reason. Whatever weighed on this woman, it was real, and it was significant enough that even a skilled painter could not help but capture it, whether he intended to or not." The conversation lingered late into the evening, William sharing stories of his own family's history in the region, tales passed down through generations of innkeepers who had witnessed the quiet dramas of countless travelers passing through their doors. Alaric found himself grateful for the company, even as his thoughts kept returning to the woman in the portrait and the mysterious hollow space discovered behind her painted image. The next morning, Alaric and Peter prepared to continue their journey toward Ashcombe County. Before departing, Alaric returned once more to Edmund's cottage, wanting to ask one final question that had occurred to him during the sleepless hours of the previous night. Edmund answered the door looking tired but welcoming as before, seemingly unsurprised by the unexpected return visit. "I apologize for disturbing you again," Alaric said, "but I wondered if you might tell me more about the chapel symbol scratched into the corner of the painting. Have you seen anything like it before, in other works by traveling painters from this region?" Edmund considered the question carefully, retrieving the portrait once more and studying the small scratched mark near its edge. "This is not something a painter typically adds," he said slowly. "It is too crude, too hastily made compared to the careful skill shown in the rest of the work. I would guess this was added later, perhaps by the subject herself, or by whoever eventually hid the portrait away." "Do you recognize the building it might represent?" Alaric pressed. "There are many small chapels throughout these 3 counties," Edmund said, spreading his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. "Without more detail, it is impossible to identify which one specifically. But if I were searching for an answer, I would look toward Ashcombe first, since that seems to be where the painter's own history is most firmly rooted. Perhaps the chapel holds some connection to him, or to the family who commissioned this portrait in the first place." Alaric thanked the old craftsman once more, feeling a renewed sense of determination as he and Peter finally set out on the road toward Ashcombe County, the coastal town still many miles ahead, the winter sky above them heavy with the promise of more snow to come. Whatever answers awaited them there, Alaric felt increasingly certain that the truth behind the portrait was far more significant than a simple case of a dropped item never recovered. Someone had hidden this woman's face deliberately, had carved a symbol into her portrait to mark something important, and had concealed an object behind the canvas that might have explained everything, had it not been removed long before Alaric ever discovered the frame buried beneath the snow. The road to Ashcombe stretched long and uncertain ahead of them, but for the first time since beginning this unusual journey, Alaric felt as though he was drawing closer to understanding not just a name, but an entire life that had once been lived with hopes, secrets, and sorrows every bit as real as his own. The road toward Ashcombe County proved far more difficult than either man had anticipated. What had begun as a light snowfall in Rosemere turned, by the second day of travel, into a genuine storm, thick flakes swirling so heavily that visibility dropped to only a few yards ahead of their horses. The wind cut through even the heaviest coats, and Alaric found himself grateful beyond measure for Peter's steady presence and practical knowledge of the land, gained from years spent working outdoors in every kind of weather Thornwood's climate could produce. By midday, they were forced to seek shelter in a small grove of pine trees just off the main road, the branches thick enough to break the worst of the wind, though not enough to keep them entirely dry. Peter built a small fire with practiced efficiency, using dry kindling he had wisely packed before their departure, and the two men huddled close to its meager warmth while their horses stood miserably nearby, blankets draped over their backs. "This is madness," Peter said, only half joking as he rubbed his hands together over the flames. "We could have waited for spring, Your Grace. The portrait would still have been there." Alaric managed a tired smile despite the circumstances. "Perhaps, but I fear if I had waited, my resolve might have weakened, and I would have convinced myself the entire matter was not worth pursuing after all. Sometimes it is better to act while the conviction still burns brightly, even if the timing is far from ideal." Peter shook his head, though there was no real complaint in the gesture, only the resigned acceptance of a loyal companion who had long ago decided to follow his employer's occasionally impractical decisions without excessive protest. They continued their journey as soon as the worst of the storm passed, though the roads remained treacherous, ice hidden beneath fresh snow, ready to send an unwary horse sliding without warning. Twice more before reaching the county border, they were forced to stop and seek shelter, once in an abandoned barn that offered little more than a break from the wind, and once, more fortunately, at a small farmhouse whose elderly owners welcomed them warmly and refused any payment for the single night's lodging, insisting that hospitality toward travelers in winter was simply the natural obligation of decent people. It was during this stop, on the third night of their journey, that Alaric encountered someone whose words would shape the remainder of his search in ways he could not have anticipated. The farmhouse belonged to an elderly couple, Grace and her husband, who had lived in the region their entire lives and remembered, in remarkable detail, the countryside's history stretching back decades. As they sat together around a modest dinner table, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and hot broth, Alaric found himself once again explaining the purpose of his journey, showing the portrait to his hosts in hopes that their long memory might offer some useful detail. Grace studied the painting for a long time before speaking, her weathered face creased with the particular concentration of someone reaching far back into memory to retrieve something nearly forgotten. "I did not know this woman myself," she said finally, "but I believe I once knew someone who might have. When I was young, before I married, I worked for a time as what they called a companion, helping wealthy families prepare their daughters for society, teaching manners and needlework and the like. There was a painter who used to visit the households where I worked, a traveling man who created portraits for young women approaching marriageable age. I remember him well, because his manner was different from other painters I encountered." "Different in what way?" Alaric asked, leaning forward with keen interest. Grace considered her words carefully. Most portrait painters wanted their subjects to appear cheerful, confident, ready to attract a suitable husband. This particular man seemed almost drawn to sadness instead. He would spend a great deal of time speaking privately with his subjects before beginning his work, asking about their hopes, their fears, sometimes even their regrets. I always thought it strange, though the resulting paintings were undeniably beautiful. He seemed to seek out young women who carried some private sorrow, and he captured that sorrow with remarkable skill, whether the family requesting the portrait wished for it or not. "Do you remember any names?" Peter asked. "Families he worked for, or perhaps his own name?" Grace shook her head slowly. "It has been too many years, and I was young myself then, more concerned with my own small worries than with remembering the details of a traveling painter's habits. But I do recall that he was well known along the coast, in Ashcombe particularly, where merchant families with newly acquired wealth were eager to commission portraits that would rival those owned by older, more established gentry." Grace's husband, who had remained mostly quiet throughout the conversation, spoke up unexpectedly. "I remember something else," he said, his voice rough with age but certain. "There was talk, many years ago, of a young woman from a merchant family who disappeared before her wedding. It caused quite a scandal at the time, though I was only a boy and remember the story mostly through the whispered conversations of adults who thought children were not listening." Alaric felt his pulse quicken. "Do you remember which family or where this took place?" The old man frowned, searching his memory with obvious effort. "I believe it was somewhere in Hallowdene," he said finally. "That was the county beyond Ashcombe, further along the coast. The story was that the young woman vanished during a winter journey, presumed lost to the cold, though some said at the time that the circumstances seemed unusual, that a young woman traveling alone in such weather made little sense unless she had reason to flee rather than simply travel." "Flee from what?" Alaric pressed, though he suspected he already knew part of the answer. "From marriage, most likely," the old man said with a shrug that suggested this was a common enough occurrence not to require further explanation. Many marriages among merchant families in those days were arranged for the benefit of business rather than for the happiness of the bride. It would not have been the first time a young woman chose disappearance over a match she found unbearable. That night, lying awake in the farmhouse's small guest room while Peter slept soundly nearby, Alaric turned these new pieces of information over in his mind again and again, trying to fit them together with what he already knew. A painter who sought out sorrowful young women. A portrait hidden away with careful deliberation. A scratched symbol resembling a chapel. And now, a story of a young woman from Hallowdene who had vanished during a winter journey, under circumstances that had struck at least some observers as unusual even at the time. Could the woman in his portrait be the very same young woman from this old story? The timing seemed to align, though Alaric reminded himself sternly that he was building an elaborate theory from little more than scattered fragments and coincidence. Many young women had likely vanished or died under difficult circumstances over the decades, and there was no certain reason to connect this particular story to his particular portrait, beyond his own growing hope that the pieces might fit together into a coherent whole. Still, the connection felt significant enough that he resolved, before sleep finally claimed him, to travel not only to Ashcombe as originally planned, but onward to Hallowdene as well, should the trail lead in that direction. Whatever the truth turned out to be, he was now more determined than ever to uncover it completely, rather than settling for a partial understanding that would leave him forever wondering about the rest. The following morning, after thanking their generous hosts and insisting, despite their protests, on leaving a modest sum of coin to help offset the cost of their hospitality, Alaric and Peter continued their journey toward the coast. The storm had finally passed overnight, leaving behind a landscape of pristine white fields glittering under a pale winter sun, the air crisp and clear in a way that made the earlier days of harsh weather feel almost like a distant memory. As they rode, Peter raised a question that had clearly been weighing on him since the previous evening's conversation. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "do you believe the woman in the portrait and the young woman from this old story of Hallowdene are truly the same person? Alaric considered the question honestly before answering. I do not know for certain, he admitted. It would be foolish to assume so based on such limited information. But the possibility feels significant enough that I cannot simply dismiss it. If nothing else, learning more about this old story may help us understand the world our painted woman lived in, even if she turns out to be someone else entirely. And if she is the same woman, Peter asked, what then? What would you hope to learn or accomplish by confirming her identity, given that whatever happened to her occurred so many years ago that nothing can now be changed? Alaric was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves against the packed snow. I suppose, he said finally, I would hope to understand her choice, whatever it was. If she indeed fled from an unwanted marriage, I would want to know that she found some measure of freedom or peace afterward, rather than simply meeting a tragic end alone in the cold. And if that peace never came, if her story ended in tragedy rather than escape, then at the very least, I would want to ensure her memory is preserved accurately, rather than lost entirely to a scandal that reduced her entire life to nothing more than a whispered rumor among gossiping neighbors. Peter nodded slowly, seeming to genuinely consider this answer rather than simply accepting it out of politeness. That is a kind intention, Your Grace, he said finally. Though I confess, I still find it remarkable that a duke would travel so far and endure such hardship for the sake of a stranger who has likely been gone from this world for many decades. Perhaps that is exactly why it matters so much to me, Alaric replied. She has no family remaining to advocate for her memory, no one left to correct whatever assumptions were made about her disappearance at the time. If I do not pursue this, who else ever will? They rode in companionable silence for the remainder of the morning, the landscape gradually shifting as they drew nearer to the coast, the flat farmland giving way to gentle rolling hills dotted with small fishing villages, their rooftops visible in the distance against the gray horizon of the sea beyond. The air carried a different quality here, salt mixed with the crisp scent of winter, and Alaric found himself feeling a renewed sense of energy despite the physical exhaustion of days spent traveling through difficult conditions. By late afternoon, they finally crossed the boundary marker indicating their arrival in Ashcombe County, a weathered stone post half buried in snow along the roadside. Alaric paused briefly beside it, studying the worn carving that marked the county's name, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment at having reached this milestone in their journey, even as he recognized that the more difficult work of actually locating answers still lay ahead of them. The largest town in the immediate area was called Millbrook Harbor, a modest but bustling port where fishing boats and small merchant vessels crowded together along wooden docks, their masts bare and still during the winter months when most sea travel came to a temporary halt. Smoke rose from countless chimneys throughout the town, and the streets, though narrow and somewhat muddy from melting snow near the busier thoroughfares, showed clear signs of a community accustomed to steady, if modest, prosperity. Alaric and Peter found lodging at an inn overlooking the harbor itself, the innkeeper a cheerful woman named Hannah, who seemed delighted by the arrival of guests during the quiet winter season. As she showed them to their rooms, Alaric could not resist asking whether she had any knowledge of a painter's family who had once lived in the area, or of a merchant family whose daughter had vanished many years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Hannah's expression grew thoughtful, and she paused on the narrow staircase, considering the question with obvious interest. The painter's family, I believe I know something of, she said finally. There was indeed a family of artists who lived here for many years, though I believe the father passed away some time ago. His daughter still lives in the town, or did the last I heard. She keeps mostly to herself these days, selling small paintings and miniatures to visitors, though her eyesight is said to be failing with age. Would you know where we might find her? Alaric asked eagerly. Hannah nodded. Her cottage sits near the eastern edge of town, past the old fish market, close to the cliffs overlooking the water. Ask anyone along that road for Clara, and they will point you in the right direction. As for the other matter, the missing daughter of a merchant family, I confess I have never heard that particular story myself, though I have only lived in this town for perhaps 15 years, having moved here after my marriage. Such old scandals tend to fade quickly once the families involved either pass away or move elsewhere, particularly if there was shame attached to the circumstances. That evening, as Alaric and Peter shared a simple meal in the inn's common room, listening to the muted conversation of local fishermen discussing the day's modest catch and the weather's likely developments over the coming days, Alaric felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness settling over him. Tomorrow, he would finally meet someone who might hold the key to understanding the painter's identity, and perhaps, by extension, the true story of the woman whose face had haunted his thoughts since that cold morning when he first uncovered her portrait in the snow. Peter, sensing his employer's restless mood, attempted to lighten the atmosphere with a light-hearted comment about the quality of the local fish stew. But Alaric's mind remained fixed on the following day's meeting, wondering what Clara might remember, and whether her memories would finally begin drawing together the scattered threads of this mystery into something resembling a complete and coherent picture. Outside, the winter night settled over Millbrook Harbor, the distant sound of waves breaking gently against the docks providing a steady, rhythmic backdrop to Alaric's restless thoughts. Somewhere in this town, he felt certain, lay the next crucial piece of the puzzle he had traveled so far and endured so much discomfort to solve, and he found himself unable to fully relax until morning finally arrived, and he could resume his search in earnest. Morning arrived clear and bright over Millbrook Harbor, sunlight glinting sharply off the frozen surface of puddles scattered throughout the narrow streets. Alaric woke early, unable to remain in bed any longer despite the exhaustion of the previous day's travel, and found Peter already awake and preparing their horses in the small stable behind the inn. They made their way through the town on foot instead, deciding to leave the horses resting after such a difficult journey, and followed Hannah's directions past the old fish market, where vendors were already arranging their modest morning catch despite the winter cold, calling out prices to the few early customers braving the chilly air. The eastern edge of town gave way gradually to a quieter residential area, small cottages spaced further apart, their gardens now bare and frost-covered, the sound of the sea growing steadily louder as they approached the cliffs. They found Clara's cottage exactly where Hannah had described, a modest stone building with a small workshop attached to one side, visible through a window filled with half-finished paintings arranged along makeshift shelves. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, and after a moment's hesitation, Alaric knocked firmly on the wooden door. The woman who answered was elderly, perhaps in her 70s, her white hair pulled back neatly, though her eyes, when she looked up at her visitors, showed the slight clouding that often accompanied failing eyesight in advanced age. She studied Alaric and Peter with evident curiosity, clearly unaccustomed to visitors this early in the day, particularly during the quiet winter season. "Good morning," Alaric said politely. "My name is Alaric, and this is my companion Peter. We were told you might be able to help us with a matter concerning a portrait and the painter who may have created it many years ago." Clara's expression shifted with interest, and she stepped back from the doorway, gesturing for them to enter. "Come in from the cold," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of age but remaining clear and steady. "It has been a long time since anyone asked me about my father's work. Most people these days are more interested in modern portraits than the old style he practiced." The interior of the cottage was warm and cluttered in the comfortable way of someone who had spent an entire lifetime surrounded by the tools and products of their craft. Paintbrushes stood in jars along every available surface, canvases leaned against walls in various states of completion, and the scent of paint and turpentine hung faintly in the air, mixing with the more comforting smell of a wood fire burning steadily in the small hearth. Alaric carefully unwrapped the portrait and set it on the small table Clara indicated, watching her expression closely as she leaned forward, adjusting her spectacles and studying the painting with obvious professional interest despite her limited eyesight. "This is fine work," she murmured, tracing her fingers gently along the edge of the frame without quite touching the painted surface itself. "The brushwork here, particularly around the eyes, This reminds me very much of my father's technique. He always said that eyes were the most important element of any portrait, that everything else could be adequate, but the eyes had to be perfect, or the entire painting would fail to capture anything true about its subject. "Do you believe your father painted this?" Alaric asked, hardly daring to hope for a definitive answer after so many days of uncertain searching. Clara continued studying the portrait for a long moment before finally nodding slowly. "I believe so, yes, though I cannot be entirely certain without seeing his old records if any of them survive. Would you allow me to check something?" She rose carefully from her chair and made her way toward a small wooden cabinet in the corner of the room, retrieving a thick, worn ledger bound in cracked leather. She returned to the table and began carefully turning its pages, each one filled with faded handwriting recording names, dates, and small notations that Alaric could not immediately decipher from where he sat. "My father kept detailed records of every commission he undertook," Clara explained as she searched through the pages. "He always said that a painter's memory was too easily corrupted by time, and that written records preserved the truth far better than recollection alone. I inherited this ledger after his passing, though I confess I have not opened it in many years." The room fell silent except for the soft rustle of turning pages and the crackle of the fire, while both Alaric and Peter waited with barely contained anticipation. Finally, Clara paused, her finger resting on a particular entry, and her expression grew suddenly solemn. "Here," she said quietly, "I believe this may be your painting." She turned the ledger around so Alaric could read the entry himself. The handwriting was cramped but legible, recording a commission dated many decades earlier, for a portrait of a young woman, daughter of a prosperous merchant family, to be completed before her upcoming marriage. The entry included a payment amount, a rough description of the requested style, and finally, a name. "Elspeth Vane," Alaric read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper as the significance of the discovery settled over him. The initials matched exactly, E and V, precisely as they had been carved into the back of the frame. Clara nodded slowly, her expression growing distant, as though reaching back through decades of memory toward something long buried. "I do remember something now," she said. "Not the woman herself. I was quite young at the time and rarely accompanied my father on these commissions, but I remember him speaking of this particular portrait afterward, in a manner different from how he usually discussed his work." "What do you mean?" Alaric asked. "He seemed troubled by it," Clara explained. "My father was not an emotional man, typically. He approached his work with professional detachment, completing each commission efficiently before moving on to the next. But after finishing this particular portrait, he seemed unusually quiet for several days afterward. When I finally asked him what troubled him, he told me only that the young woman had confided something to him during their sessions together, something he felt obligated to keep private, though it clearly weighed heavily on his conscience." "Did he ever tell you what it was?" Peter asked. Clara shook her head. "Never. He was a man of his word, and if he promised to keep a confidence, he would carry it to his grave rather than betray that trust. I only know that whatever she told him affected him deeply, enough that he mentioned the encounter to me even years later, on occasions when we discussed his most memorable commissions." Alaric felt a mixture of frustration and renewed determination at this revelation. So close to an answer, yet still separated by a wall of secrecy maintained even beyond the grave. "Do you know what became of the family afterward?" he asked, "or of Elspeth herself?" Clara's expression grew troubled, and she was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I do recall, now that you mention it, hearing something about a terrible fire that swept through parts of Hallowdene not long after this portrait was completed. Many records were lost in that fire, along with several lives, if I remember correctly. It caused quite a stir throughout the region at the time, though the specific details have faded from my memory over the years." "Do you know if the Vane family was affected by this fire?" Alaric pressed. "I could not say for certain," Clara admitted. "But given the timing you describe, and given how deeply this particular portrait affected my father, it would not surprise me if there was some connection. Perhaps the fire is what led to Elspeth's disappearance, or perhaps her disappearance and the fire were entirely unrelated events that simply occurred within the same troubled period. Without further records, it is impossible to know for certain. Alaric sat back in his chair, his mind working rapidly to process this new information alongside everything he had already learned. A portrait commissioned before a wedding. A young woman who confided some troubling secret to the painter creating her image. A devastating fire that swept through Hallowdene shortly afterward, destroying records and claiming lives. And somewhere within all of this, Elspeth Vane herself, whose fate remained frustratingly unclear despite every new piece of information they managed to uncover. "Would you be willing to let me examine the portrait more closely?" Clara asked suddenly. "There may be details in my father's technique that could tell us more, even without written records to consult." Alaric agreed readily, and Clara spent several minutes studying the painting with the careful attention of someone deeply familiar with the specific methods and habits of its creator. Finally, she pointed toward a small area near the lower corner of the canvas, close to where the scratched chapel symbol had been discovered. "This mark here," she said, indicating the crude scratching, "this was definitely not made by my father. His work was always precise, even in small details. Whoever added this symbol did so afterward, likely without any artistic training, using something sharp but imprecise, perhaps a knife or a similar tool. If I had to guess, I would say this was added by the subject herself, or by someone close to her, after the painting was already completed and delivered to the family." "Do you have any thoughts on what the symbol might represent?" Peter asked. Clara considered the shape carefully before answering. "It does resemble a small chapel or church, as you suggested. There are several such structures scattered throughout Hallowdene, though without more specific detail, I cannot identify which particular building this might represent. However, I do recall my father mentioning, during that same period when he seemed troubled by this commission, that the Vane family maintained a private chapel on their estate grounds, used primarily for family occasions rather than regular worship services. It is possible this symbol refers to that specific location, though I cannot say for certain." This revelation settled over Alaric with significant weight. A private family chapel, scratched deliberately into a portrait otherwise created with professional skill and care. It felt like more than a random detail, more like a deliberate marker pointing toward something specific. Something perhaps connected to whatever secret Elspeth had confided to the painter during their sessions together. "I believe our next destination must be Hallowdene itself," Alaric said finally, more to himself than to his companions. "If the Vane family's estate still exists, or if any records of the family survive despite the fire, that is where we are most likely to find the answers we seek." Clara nodded slowly in agreement. It would seem the logical next step, given everything we have discussed. Though I would caution you both that Hallowdene is not a large county, and scandals from decades past are not always welcomed back into conversation by those who remember them, particularly if the circumstances involved shame or tragedy for a prominent local family. You may find people reluctant to discuss the matter openly, even after so much time has passed. Alaric thanked Clara sincerely for her assistance, recognizing the significant progress they had made through her knowledge and her father's carefully preserved records. Before departing, he asked one final question that had been forming in his mind throughout their conversation. "Do you believe Elspeth survived whatever happened to her?" he asked. "Or do you believe her fate ended in tragedy?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful and somewhat sad. "I cannot know the answer to that question," she admitted honestly, "but I will say this. A woman troubled enough to confide a serious secret to a stranger, and desperate enough to hide her own portrait rather than allow it to remain within her family's possession, strikes me as someone determined to control her own fate, whatever the cost. Whether that determination led her toward freedom or toward tragedy, I cannot say. But I do not believe she was merely a passive victim of circumstance. Whatever happened to Elspeth Vane, I suspect she made it happen herself, for better or worse." As Alaric and Peter made their way back through Millbrook Harbor toward their waiting horses, the winter sun climbing higher into a clear blue sky, Alaric found himself turning Clara's final words over repeatedly in his mind. A woman who shaped her own fate, rather than simply enduring whatever circumstances life presented to her. It was a compelling image, one that made the mystery feel less like a search for a tragic victim, and more like an attempt to understand a woman of genuine courage and determination, whose story deserved to be told accurately rather than reduced to vague rumors of an unfortunate disappearance. With renewed purpose, they prepared their horses for the final leg of their journey, toward Hallowdene County and whatever remained of the Vane family's history, hoping desperately that enough records or memories had survived the fire to finally provide the complete answer Alaric had been seeking since that cold morning, when he first uncovered the portrait buried beneath the snow. The road to Hallowdene wound along the coastline for the better part of 2 days, the sea a constant gray presence to their right, waves crashing against dark rocks below steep cliffs in a rhythm that seemed to grow more urgent as they traveled further from Millbrook Harbor. The weather remained clear but bitterly cold, and both men found themselves grateful for the relatively easier terrain compared to the treacherous inland roads they had endured earlier in their journey. Hallowdene itself proved smaller than either Rosemere or Ashcombe, its main town little more than a cluster of buildings arranged around a central square, dominated by an old stone church whose bell tower rose above every other structure in sight. Alaric felt his pulse quicken slightly at the sight of the church, wondering if this might be connected to the chapel symbol scratched into the portrait, though he reminded himself that such an obvious connection seemed unlikely, given that Clara had specifically mentioned a private family chapel rather than the town's public house of worship. They secured lodging at the only in the small town offered, a modest establishment run by a middle-aged woman named Charlotte, who eyed her unfamiliar guests with the particular wariness small communities often reserved for outsiders arriving unexpectedly during the quiet winter months. "We are searching for information about a family that once lived in this area," Alaric explained carefully, choosing his words with more caution than he had used in previous towns, mindful of Clara's warning about local reluctance to discuss old scandals. "The Vane family, if you have any knowledge of them." Charlotte's expression shifted noticeably at the mention of the name, her earlier wariness deepening into something closer to genuine suspicion. "Why would you be asking about them?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral but clearly guarded. Alaric considered how much to reveal, ultimately deciding that honesty seemed the wisest approach given the sensitivity Charlotte's reaction suggested. "I found an old portrait," he explained, "believed to depict a young woman from that family, many years ago. I have traveled a considerable distance trying to learn her story and understand what became of her." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, her expression gradually softening slightly, though wariness remained evident in her posture. "That would be old history now," she said finally. "Most people around here prefer not to speak of it, out of respect for the family that remains, though I suppose enough time has passed that no real harm could come from simple curiosity about the past." "Does the family still live in the area?" Peter asked. Charlotte nodded slowly. "The estate still stands, though it has changed hands somewhat over the generations. Nathaniel Vane lives there now, a distant relation, I believe, of whoever owned the property originally. He keeps mostly to himself, does not involve himself much in town affairs, though he is not unkind when approached directly." "Would you be able to direct us to the estate?" Alaric asked. Charlotte hesitated only briefly before nodding again. "It sits about 2 miles outside town, along the northern road. You will recognize it by the old stone gates at the entrance, though I would advise sending word ahead if you can manage it, rather than simply arriving unannounced. Nathaniel values his privacy considerably, and unexpected visitors asking about family history from decades past may not receive the warmest welcome." Following Charlotte's advice, Alaric composed a brief letter that evening, explaining his discovery and his hope of learning more about the family's history, careful to frame his interest with appropriate respect and sensitivity given the apparent sensitivity surrounding the subject. He arranged for a local boy to deliver the letter to the estate the following morning, and spent an anxious day waiting for some response, uncertain whether Nathaniel Vane would be willing to meet with them at all. To his relief, a reply arrived that evening, brief but welcoming, inviting Alaric and Peter to visit the estate the following afternoon. The letter was written in a careful, educated hand, and though its tone remained somewhat formal, it expressed genuine curiosity about the portrait Alaric had described. The Vane estate, when they finally arrived the following day, proved to be an impressive though somewhat weathered property, its main house built from the same gray stone common throughout the region, surrounded by extensive grounds that had clearly once been maintained with considerable care, but now showed signs of gradual neglect consistent with reduced fortunes over the passing decades. Nathaniel Vane himself greeted them at the door personally, a man perhaps in his 50s, with gray hair and a reserved but not unfriendly manner. He led them into a comfortable study lined with bookshelves and old family portraits, several of which bore a resemblance, Alaric noted immediately, to the woman depicted in the painting he carried. "You mentioned in your letter that you had discovered a portrait believed to depict a member of my family," Nathaniel said, once they were all settled comfortably with refreshments provided by a quiet household servant. "I confess I am quite curious to see it myself, though I should tell you up front that our family's history contains certain chapters that were rarely discussed even among ourselves, let alone with strangers." Alaric carefully unwrapped the portrait and handed it across to Nathaniel, watching closely as the man's expression shifted from polite curiosity to something far more intense and personal. "This is Elspeth," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice carrying unmistakable emotion despite his evident attempts to maintain composure. "I recognize her from other family portraits, though I never knew her personally, of course. She lived several generations before my own time, but her story has been passed down within our family, in fragments at least, as a kind of cautionary tale, or perhaps simply as an unresolved tragedy that no one ever fully explained." "What do you know of her story?" Alaric asked gently. Nathaniel set the portrait down carefully and was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts before answering. Elspeth Vane was engaged to be married, he began, to a man from a prosperous family in a neighboring county, a match arranged primarily for business advantage rather than personal affection, as was common enough practice among merchant families during that era. According to family accounts, she disappeared during the winter before her wedding was to take place, presumed to have died while traveling, though her body was never recovered. "Do you know the circumstances of her disappearance in more detail?" Peter asked. Nathaniel shook his head slowly, not with any certainty. The family records from that period were largely destroyed in a terrible fire that swept through part of our estate shortly after Elspeth vanished. Whatever documentation might have explained the full circumstances was lost along with a significant portion of our family's history from that entire era. Alaric leaned forward with keen interest. "Do you know how the fire started, or whether it might be connected to Elspeth's disappearance in some way?" "Family legend suggests the two events were related," Nathaniel admitted, though the exact nature of that connection has never been entirely clear, even within our own family's oral tradition. Some versions of the story suggest the fire began accidentally, perhaps from an unattended candle or fireplace, and that its timing shortly after Elspeth's disappearance was simply an unfortunate coincidence occurring during an already difficult period for the family. Other versions suggest something more deliberate, though I have never found this interpretation particularly convincing, given the lack of any concrete evidence to support it. "What do you believe happened to her personally?" Alaric asked. "Do you think she truly perished during that winter journey, or is it possible she survived and simply chose never to return?" Nathaniel considered this question with evident seriousness, clearly having pondered it himself many times over the years. "I honestly do not know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to believe she survived, that she found some way to escape a marriage she clearly did not want and built a different life for herself elsewhere, far from the constraints and expectations that had governed her existence until that point. But another part of me recognizes that a young woman traveling alone through harsh winter conditions, without resources or a clear destination, faced tremendous danger, and the more likely explanation remains that she simply perished somewhere along her journey, her remains never discovered due to the harsh terrain and weather conditions common throughout this region during winter months. Alaric felt a mixture of hope and sorrow as he listened to Nathaniel's careful explanation, recognizing that the mystery he had traveled so far to solve might ultimately remain unresolved, at least regarding Elspeth's final fate. Yet something about the portrait, about the carefully carved letters and the deliberately scratched chapel symbol, suggested a level of intention and planning inconsistent with a woman who simply wandered off unprepared into a fatal winter storm. Do you know anything about a private chapel that may have existed on your family's estate grounds during that period? Alaric asked, recalling Clara's earlier suggestion. Nathaniel's expression shifted with surprise at this specific question. Indeed, he said, there was once a small private chapel on the eastern edge of our property, used primarily for family ceremonies rather than regular worship. It fell into disrepair many generations ago and was eventually demolished, though its foundation stones remain visible if one knows where to look. Why do you ask? Alaric explained the scratched symbol discovered on the portrait's surface, watching as Nathaniel's expression grew increasingly thoughtful and intent. That is remarkable, Nathaniel said finally. I have never heard any family account connecting Elspeth specifically to that chapel, but it stood not far from the forest road leading toward the county boundary, precisely the direction she would have traveled had she indeed attempted to flee toward the northern counties rather than remaining to fulfill her arranged marriage. Would it be possible for us to visit the location of this former chapel? Alaric asked, feeling a renewed surge of hope that this specific place might hold some final answer to the mystery that had consumed his thoughts for so many days. Nathaniel agreed readily, seeming genuinely invested now in uncovering whatever remained of his distant relative's story. He arranged for them to visit the site the following morning, promising to bring along whatever family documents had survived the fire, in case any further details might prove relevant to their search. That evening, back at the inn, Alaric found himself unable to fully relax, his mind churning through everything Nathaniel had shared. The pieces of the mystery were finally beginning to align into something resembling a coherent story, though significant gaps remained. Elspeth had faced an unwanted marriage. She had confided some troubling secret to the painter creating her portrait. She had disappeared during a winter journey shortly before her wedding. Around the same time, a devastating fire swept through her family's estate. And somewhere connected to all of this stood a small private chapel, now reduced to nothing more than scattered foundation stones, yet apparently significant enough that Elspeth had marked its symbol permanently into her own portrait before it was hidden away, and eventually lost for generations beneath the snow of Alaric's own estate. Peter, noticing his employer's restless mood over dinner, finally broached a question that had clearly been forming in his mind throughout the day's revelations. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "do you believe the chapel holds some physical clue to Elspeth's fate? Or do you think its significance is purely symbolic, representing perhaps a place of personal meaning to her rather than a literal destination connected to her disappearance?" Alaric considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I am not certain," he admitted. "But given everything we have learned, I suspect the chapel held genuine significance to her, perhaps as a place of quiet refuge away from her family's expectations, or perhaps as a meeting point for some plan she had devised to escape her circumstances. Whether we will find anything of substance remaining there after so many decades, I cannot say. But I feel strongly that we must look, regardless of what we ultimately discover." The following morning arrived cold but clear, and Alaric, Peter, and Nathaniel made their way together toward the eastern edge of the Vane estate, where the forest gradually thickened along the boundary marking the property's edge. Nathaniel led them confidently despite the overgrown path, clearly familiar with the general location, even if actual visits to the site had grown infrequent over recent years. After nearly half an hour of careful walking through snow drifted deeply between the trees, Nathaniel finally paused, gesturing toward a small clearing where several weathered stones, clearly arranged deliberately rather than scattered by natural processes, marked the outline of what had once been a modest structure. "This is the site of the old family chapel," Nathaniel confirmed, brushing snow away from one of the larger foundation stones, to reveal faint carved markings that had somehow survived the passage of many decades. Alaric knelt beside the stones, studying them carefully, uncertain exactly what he hoped to find, but feeling nonetheless that some crucial piece of the puzzle awaited discovery in this quiet, forgotten place, hidden away in the depths of a forest that had likely changed remarkably little since the winter, so many generations ago, when Elspeth Vane had apparently marked this very location as significant enough to preserve permanently within the corner of her own hidden portrait. Snow had drifted deeply against the northern side of the ruined chapel walls, and Alaric spent nearly an hour clearing it away by hand, ignoring the cold that quickly numbed his fingers through his gloves, driven by an instinct he could not fully explain. Peter joined him without complaint, while Nathaniel stood nearby, occasionally offering guidance based on faint childhood memories of exploring these grounds decades earlier, before the passage of time had reclaimed the site so thoroughly for the surrounding forest. It was Peter who first noticed something unusual, a section of the foundation where the stones appeared slightly disturbed compared to the rest of the structure, as though they had been removed and replaced at some point after the chapel's original construction. "Your Grace," he called out, "come look at this." Alaric hurried over and knelt beside the section Peter indicated. Upon closer examination, it became clear that several stones had indeed been repositioned, fitted together less precisely than the surrounding foundation, suggesting deliberate disturbance rather than natural settling over time. Working carefully, the two men managed to pry several of the loose stones free, revealing a small hollow space beneath, roughly the size of a modest box, carved directly into the earth beneath the chapel's foundation. Nathaniel crouched beside them, his expression tense with anticipation as Alaric reached carefully into the hollow space, his fingers closing around something solid wrapped in what remained of decayed cloth, much like the covering that had originally protected the portrait itself. He lifted the object carefully and brushed away accumulated dirt and decayed fabric to reveal a small metal box, its surface tarnished but otherwise remarkably well preserved, protected from the elements by its position beneath the stone foundation. The box was locked, but the mechanism had rusted considerably over the decades, and after several careful attempts, Peter managed to work it open using a small knife from his pack. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved its contents far better than anyone might have expected after so many years, lay a bundle of folded papers, their edges brittle with age, but the writing upon them still legible enough to read with careful attention. Alaric's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the topmost paper, recognizing immediately the same careful, educated handwriting that had appeared in the painter's old ledger, though this script belonged to a different hand entirely, more delicate and clearly written by someone accustomed to expressing personal thoughts rather than simple business transactions. "If these words are ever found," the letter began, "then perhaps fate has decided that my story deserves to be known, rather than buried alongside whatever fate ultimately befalls me." Alaric read the letter aloud, his voice growing steadier as he continued, while Peter and Nathaniel listened with rapt attention, the cold forest around them seeming to fade into insignificance compared to the weight of the words finally emerging after so many decades of silence. "My name is Elspeth Vane," the letter continued, "and I write this account not knowing whether I will survive the journey I am about to undertake, nor whether anyone will ever discover these words should I fail to reach my intended destination safely." The letter went on to describe, in careful and measured detail, the circumstances that had led Elspeth to this desperate decision. Her engagement had indeed been arranged entirely for business purposes, her family eager to secure a valuable trading partnership through her marriage to a man she had met only twice before their engagement was formally announced. She described him not as cruel, but as entirely indifferent to her as a person, viewing their upcoming marriage purely as a practical arrangement rather than any genuine partnership. I do not hate him, the letter explained, but I cannot imagine spending the remainder of my life bound to someone who sees me merely as a useful connection between two prosperous families, rather than as a woman with hopes and dreams of my own. I had hoped when I was younger for a different kind of life, though I understand now how foolish such hopes appeared to my family, given the practical realities of our circumstances. The letter then described how Elspeth had confided her distress to the traveling painter during the many hours she spent sitting for her portrait, finding in him an unexpected source of sympathy, and understanding that she had found nowhere else within her own household. It was the painter, according to her account, who had first suggested that escape remained possible, that a woman with sufficient courage and careful planning could indeed forge a different path for herself, however dangerous and uncertain such a choice might prove. He told me of a distant relation of his, Elspeth wrote, a woman who had similarly fled an unwanted arrangement many years earlier and successfully built a new life in a distant county, under a different name, far from the reach of family expectations or social scandal. His words gave me hope that such an escape, however difficult, was not entirely impossible for a woman determined enough to attempt it. Alaric paused in his reading, glancing toward Nathaniel, whose expression had grown increasingly emotional as the story unfolded, clearly moved by finally learning the true circumstances behind a family mystery that had lingered unresolved for so many generations. The letter continued, describing how Elspeth had carefully planned her escape over several months, secretly gathering resources and making arrangements for the difficult winter journey she knew would be necessary to put sufficient distance between herself and her family before her absence was discovered. She had hidden her portrait rather than allowing it to remain within her family's possession, fearing that its distinctive appearance might later be used to identify and locate her should anyone attempt a serious search. I have marked this letter's hiding place with a symbol only I would recognize. The letter explained, referring to the scratched chapel that Alaric now understood represented this very location, the private family chapel where Elspeth had apparently spent countless private hours away from her family's watchful attention, planning the details of her eventual escape. Should I succeed in reaching safety, Elspeth had written, I intend eventually to return for this letter and for my portrait, once sufficient time has passed that I no longer fear discovery. But should something befall me during my journey, I leave this account so that whoever eventually finds it will understand that I chose this path willingly, with full knowledge of its dangers, rather than being forced into circumstances beyond my control. The letter's final passage described her planned route, heading north through unfamiliar territory toward a distant relative of the painter who had promised to help her establish a new identity far from Hallowdene and the marriage she had chosen to refuse. She wrote of setting out during a particularly harsh winter storm specifically, believing that the difficult weather would discourage any immediate pursuit and provide better cover for her escape. Alaric finished reading and sat back on his heels in the snow, his mind racing to process everything they had just discovered. It seemed clear now that Elspeth had indeed successfully begun her escape, hiding both her portrait and this explanatory letter before departing on her dangerous winter journey. The question remaining was whether she had ultimately succeeded in reaching safety, or whether the portrait's discovery, buried and forgotten near Thornwood's northern boundary, suggested a far more tragic ending to her carefully planned journey. Nathaniel spoke first, his voice thick with emotion. "This changes everything I believed about my family's history," he said quietly. "All these years, we assumed her disappearance was simply a tragic accident, a young woman lost to harsh weather during an ill-advised journey. But she was not simply lost. She made a deliberate choice, however dangerous, to seek her own freedom rather than accept a fate imposed upon her by others." Peter, who had remained quiet throughout the reading, finally spoke as well. "Your Grace," he said, "if she was traveling north from Hallowdene, attempting to reach the relative of the painter who lived in some distant county, could her route have potentially passed near Thornwood itself?" Alaric considered this question carefully, recalling the geography of the 3 counties they had now traveled through in their search. It seemed entirely plausible. He realized that a woman fleeing Halloween during winter, seeking safety in a distant northern county, might indeed have passed through or near his own estate's boundaries, particularly given that the forest road where he had originally discovered the portrait connected directly to older trade routes that had once served travelers moving between the 3 counties. If that is true, Alaric said slowly, then perhaps she did not lose the portrait accidentally during her journey after all. Perhaps she deliberately buried it again, near my own estate's boundary, for reasons we may never fully understand, unless something in the fire's aftermath forced her to change her original plans. Nathaniel's expression grew troubled at this suggestion. "There is something else you should know," he said finally. "The fire that swept through our estate did not begin randomly, according to certain accounts passed down within our family that I had always dismissed as unreliable rumor rather than factual history. Some believed the fire was started deliberately, as a means of destroying records that might otherwise have revealed Elspeth's true intentions and assisted anyone attempting to track her movements afterward." "Do you believe she started the fire herself?" Alaric asked. "I cannot say for certain," Nathaniel admitted. "But given everything we now know of her careful planning and evident determination, it does not seem impossible that she, or perhaps someone assisting her, deliberately set that fire as a final measure to prevent any effective pursuit, understanding that a family desperate to salvage important business documents and property records would be far less capable of organizing an immediate search for a missing daughter." The implications of this theory settled heavily over the small group gathered in the snow-covered clearing. Elspeth Vane, it seemed, had not simply fled an unwanted marriage through desperate impulse, but had instead executed a carefully considered plan involving not just her own escape, but potentially the deliberate destruction of evidence that might otherwise have compromised her chances of successfully disappearing entirely from the life that had been arranged for her without her consent. As the afternoon light began fading toward evening, casting long shadows across the ruined chapel's foundation stones, Alaric carefully rewrapped the letter and returned it, along with the metal box, to his traveling pack, treating the fragile documents with the same careful reverence he had shown the portrait itself since the morning of its original discovery. "We must determine what became of her after this point," Alaric said finally, as the 3 men began making their way back through the darkening forest toward the Vane estate. "If she indeed traveled north, passing perhaps through my own lands, there may yet be further clues awaiting discovery, either confirming her successful escape or revealing whatever tragic circumstances ultimately led to her portrait being buried and forgotten so close to my own family's boundary." Nathaniel nodded in agreement, his expression a complex mixture of sorrow for his ancestors' evident suffering and quiet admiration for the courage her actions had required. "Whatever the final answer proves to be," he said, "I am grateful beyond measure that you have brought this story to light after so many generations of uncertainty. Elspeth deserves to be remembered accurately, whether her story ultimately ended in tragedy or in the freedom she so desperately sought." That evening, back at the estate, Nathaniel insisted that Alaric and Peter remain as guests for dinner, eager to discuss further the remarkable discoveries of the day, and to consult additional family records that had survived the fire, hoping some further detail might help complete the picture of Elspeth's ultimate fate. As they sat together around the dining table, the metal box and its precious contents resting nearby, Alaric felt a profound sense that they were finally approaching the true conclusion of a mystery that had begun so unexpectedly, weeks earlier, with a startled horse and a portrait half buried in the snow along his own estate's quiet northern boundary. The journey back toward Thornwood felt different from the outward trip, despite following largely the same roads through Ashcombe and Rosemere. Where before Alaric had traveled with uncertain hope, now he carried genuine knowledge, a name, a letter, and a story that had finally begun taking coherent shape after so many days of scattered fragments and cautious speculation. Nathaniel had insisted on accompanying them for this final stage of the search, eager to see the investigation through to whatever conclusion awaited, and grateful for the chance to finally understand his own family's long-buried history. They stopped only briefly in Ashcombe to share their discoveries with Clara, who received the news of Elspeth's letter with visible emotion, murmuring quietly that her father would have been relieved to know the secret he had carried so faithfully for the remainder of his life had finally been honored rather than simply lost to time. He always believed she deserved better than the life planned for her, Clara said softly, studying the old letter with careful reverence. I am glad, in whatever small way I contributed, to have helped uncover the truth of what she ultimately chose to do with the courage he helped inspire in her. From Ashcombe, they continued directly toward Thornwood, bypassing Rosemere entirely in their eagerness to reach the final stretch of road where the entire mystery had originally begun. Alaric found himself studying the landscape with new eyes as they approached familiar territory, imagining Elspeth traveling this same difficult path generations earlier, alone and frightened perhaps, but driven forward by fierce determination to reach whatever safety awaited her beyond the county boundaries she had known her entire life. Upon finally arriving back at Thornwood Hall, Alaric wasted no time consulting the estate's own records, as well as those maintained by the small parish church that served the surrounding villages, hoping desperately that some documentation might have survived from the period when Elspeth would have passed through this region during her difficult winter journey. Harold, upon learning of everything discovered during their travels, proved instrumental in locating the oldest available parish records, stored carefully in the church's small archive room, their pages yellowed and fragile but largely intact thanks to careful preservation over the generations. It took nearly 2 full days of careful searching through decades of faded handwriting before Alaric finally found what he had been searching for, an entry recorded by the parish priest of that era, noting the discovery of an unknown woman found near the old forest road during a severe winter storm, her identity never determined. Her body ultimately laid to rest in the churchyard's northern section, reserved for travelers and strangers whose families could not be located or notified. Alaric sat motionless for a long moment after reading this entry, feeling a complex mixture of sorrow and quiet vindication settle over him. The pieces finally fit together completely. Elspeth had indeed traveled this far during her desperate winter escape, likely believing herself close enough to safety that she paused to bury her portrait and the accompanying letter beneath the tree roots near the old stone wall, perhaps intending to retrieve them later, once she had successfully established her new life, or perhaps hiding them simply as a precaution against discovery should she be found and forced to return home against her will. But the harsh winter conditions that had aided her escape from Hallowdene had ultimately proven fatal during this final stretch of her journey. The same storm that had helped conceal her departure from her family, eventually claiming her life, before she could complete the difficult crossing into safety beyond Thornwood's boundaries. Alaric brought this discovery immediately to Nathaniel, who had remained at Thornwood Hall during these final days of research, and watched as his companion absorbed the news with quiet, dignified grief. She almost made it, Nathaniel said finally, his voice thick with emotion, so close to whatever safety and freedom she had risked everything to find. Alaric nodded slowly, feeling the weight of this realization settle over him as well. Yet she did not die simply as a nameless victim of harsh weather, he said. She died attempting to claim a life of her own choosing, having already demonstrated remarkable courage and determination throughout her carefully planned escape. That distinction matters, I believe, even now, so many generations later. Peter, who had been present for this final revelation as well, spoke up thoughtfully. Your Grace, he said, do you believe she knew, in her final moments, that her portrait and letter would eventually be found? Or do you think she died believing her story would remain forever unknown, buried alongside her secrets in the snow? Alaric considered this question carefully before answering. I cannot know for certain, he admitted. But given the deliberate manner in which she wrapped and hid both items, I believe she held on to hope until the very end. Hope that someone, someday, might discover the truth and understand what she had attempted to achieve. Perhaps she could not have imagined the specific circumstances that eventually led to their discovery, but I believe she trusted that her story mattered enough to eventually find its way into the light, however long that process might ultimately require. The following morning, Alaric visited the churchyard himself, accompanied by both Peter and Nathaniel, seeking the specific location described in the old parish records where the unidentified woman had been laid to rest so many generations earlier. The northern section of the churchyard, reserved traditionally for strangers and travelers without known family connections, contained only a scattering of simple, unmarked stones, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of weather. Any inscriptions they might once have carried long since faded beyond legibility. Using the parish records as a guide, along with careful measurements from more permanent landmarks within the churchyard, they eventually identified what appeared to be the correct grave, marked by nothing more than a small, unremarkable stone that gave no indication whatsoever of the remarkable and courageous life that had ended beneath it so many years before. Alaric stood quietly before the simple marker for a long time, the cold morning air settling around them as snow began falling gently once more, dusting the churchyard in a fresh layer of white that seemed, in that particular moment, less like harsh winter weather and more like a quiet, respectful blessing settling over a grave that had waited so long to finally be properly acknowledged and understood. "She deserves a proper marker," Alaric said finally, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled over the small group. "Something that honors who she truly was, rather than leaving her forever as merely an unidentified traveler who happened to perish during an unfortunate winter storm." Nathaniel nodded in immediate agreement, his expression solemn but also carrying something that looked almost like relief, the satisfaction of finally understanding a story that had troubled his family's history for so many generations without resolution. "I would be honored to contribute toward such a memorial," he said. "It seems only fitting that her true family, however distant our connection may now be, should help ensure her memory is finally preserved with the dignity and respect her courage clearly deserved." As they made their way back toward Thornwood Hall through the gently falling snow, Alaric found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought him to this point, beginning with nothing more than a startled horse and a half-buried portrait, and culminating now in a complete understanding of a woman's courageous, ultimately tragic attempt to claim freedom and self-determination in a world that had offered her little opportunity to exercise either. Yet even amid the sorrow of learning that Elspeth's journey had ended in death, rather than the successful escape she had hoped to achieve, Alaric felt a genuine sense of accomplishment and closure. Her story would no longer remain buried and forgotten, reduced to vague rumors of a mysterious disappearance whispered occasionally among people who barely remembered the details themselves. Instead, her courage and determination would finally be properly recognized and honored, her true fate understood rather than left as an unsolved mystery, destined to fade completely from memory as the final witnesses to her story eventually passed away themselves. That evening, back at Thornwood Hall, Alaric sat once more in his study, the portrait resting on his desk alongside the recovered letter and metal box, while a fire crackled steadily in the hearth, providing welcome warmth after the cold hours spent in the churchyard. Nathaniel and Peter had retired for the evening, but Alaric found himself unable to sleep just yet, wanting instead to sit quietly with the woman whose story had consumed his thoughts and driven his actions across 3 counties over the course of these remarkable weeks. "I found you," he said quietly to the painted image before him, her steady, sorrowful eyes seeming somehow less burdened now, as though the simple act of finally understanding her story had lifted some invisible weight from the portrait itself. "I am sorry your journey ended before you could reach the freedom you sought so bravely. But I promise you this: your name will not be forgotten again. Your courage will be remembered, and your story will finally be told truthfully, exactly as you intended when you hid this portrait and your letter so carefully, trusting that someday, someone would care enough to uncover the truth." Outside, snow continued falling steadily over Thornwood's quiet grounds, the same gentle, persistent snow that had once concealed Elspeth Vane's final secrets for so many generations, but which now seemed instead to represent something closer to peaceful closure. A fitting conclusion to a story that had finally, after so long, found its way completely into the light. Spring arrived slowly that year, the snow retreating gradually from Thornwood's fields and forests, revealing the first tentative signs of green pushing through soil that had spent months hidden beneath winter's heavy blanket. Alaric had spent the intervening weeks corresponding regularly with Nathaniel, exchanging letters that gradually developed plans for a proper memorial honoring Elspeth Vane, a project that had grown to involve not just the two of them, but eventually Clara as well, who insisted on contributing her own artistic skills toward the effort despite her advancing years and failing eyesight. The memorial itself took shape gradually over the following months, a modest but dignified stone marker to be placed within the churchyard, where Elspeth's remains had rested anonymously for so many generations. Alaric commissioned a local stonemason, a careful craftsman named Edward, who approached the project with evident respect once he learned the remarkable story behind the request, to carve not merely a name and dates, but a brief inscription capturing something of Elspeth's true character and the courage that had defined her final, fateful journey. Clara, meanwhile, undertook the delicate task of creating a smaller companion piece, a modest painted image based on careful study of the original portrait, intended to be displayed within the parish church itself, alongside a brief written account of Elspeth's story, ensuring that future generations passing through the church would understand the full history behind the newly placed memorial stone, rather than encountering merely another anonymous marker among the churchyard's many older graves. "Your father would be proud," Alaric told her during one of several visits she made to Thornwood that spring, to see his final commission finally understood so completely, after carrying its secret burden for so many years without ever betraying the trust placed in him. Clara smiled, though her expression carried a complicated mixture of emotions, gratitude alongside lingering sadness for a story that had ultimately ended in tragedy despite its courageous intentions. "He always believed that art carried responsibility," she said quietly, "not merely to capture beauty, but to preserve truth as well, even when that truth remained hidden for a time. I believe he would consider this a fitting conclusion to work he clearly considered among the most meaningful of his career." As preparations for the memorial continued, word of Alaric's remarkable journey and discovery gradually spread throughout the surrounding counties, carried initially through simple gossip among servants and tradespeople, but eventually reaching wider audiences as the story's genuine emotional resonance captured public imagination in ways Alaric had never anticipated when he first set out from Thornwood Hall in pursuit of nothing more than personal curiosity. Several local historians expressed interest in documenting the full story more formally, requesting access to the recovered letter and portrait in order to preserve accurate records for future scholarly reference. Alaric agreed readily to these requests, recognizing that Elspeth's story deserved preservation beyond merely a single memorial stone, however meaningful that marker might prove to those who eventually encountered it. Nathaniel, for his part, found himself unexpectedly transformed by the entire experience, developing over the following months a deepening interest in his own family's broader history that extended well beyond the specific mystery of Elspeth's disappearance. He began systematically reviewing whatever family records had survived the old fire, cross-referencing them carefully against local parish archives and other historical documents, gradually piecing together a more complete understanding of the Vane family's history across multiple generations. "I never much cared about family history before this," Nathaniel admitted during one visit to Thornwood, as spring gradually gave way toward the warmer days of early summer. "I suppose I always assumed such things belonged safely in the past, with little genuine relevance to my own present circumstances. But learning Elspeth's true story has shown me how much value exists in understanding where we truly come from, rather than accepting comfortable but inaccurate assumptions simply because they require less effort to maintain." The memorial's formal dedication finally took place on a warm afternoon in early summer, nearly 6 months after Alaric had first discovered the portrait buried in winter snow along Thornwood's northern boundary. A modest gathering assembled within the churchyard, including Nathaniel and several members of his extended family who had traveled considerable distance upon learning of the ceremony, along with Clara, who had insisted on making the journey despite her age and the physical difficulty such travel now presented for her. The parish priest, a thoughtful young man named Edmund, though unrelated to the elderly framer Alaric had met months earlier in Rosemere, delivered a brief but heartfelt address acknowledging the remarkable circumstances that had led to this long-overdue recognition of a woman whose courage had gone unacknowledged for so many generations. "We often assume," the priest said, addressing the small gathering with quiet sincerity, "that history belongs entirely to those with power, wealth, or fame sufficient to ensure their stories survive naturally through the passage of time. But today we honor someone whose courage was extraordinary precisely because she possessed none of these advantages, a young woman who risked everything she had, including ultimately her own life, simply to claim the basic freedom of choosing her own path forward, rather than accepting a fate determined entirely by others." Alaric, standing near the front of the small gathering, found himself moved unexpectedly by these words, recognizing how completely his understanding of the entire situation had evolved since that cold winter morning, when he had first uncovered nothing more than a beautiful but mysterious painted face, half hidden beneath drifted snow. Following the priest's address, the new memorial stone was formally unveiled, its careful inscription reading simply but powerfully, honoring Elspeth Vane's memory and briefly acknowledging the courage that had defined her final journey toward freedom she ultimately never fully achieved, though her attempt itself had proven remarkable enough to finally merit proper recognition after so many generations of unjust anonymity. After the formal ceremony concluded, as the small gathering began dispersing gradually back toward their various homes and obligations, Alaric found himself standing alone once more before the newly placed memorial, much as he had stood alone before the simple unmarked stone many months earlier, though the emotional weight of the moment now felt entirely different, resolved rather than uncertain, closure rather than mystery. Peter approached quietly, standing beside his employer for a long moment without speaking, before finally breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Your Grace," he said, "do you feel satisfied now, having finally completed this remarkable journey you began so many months ago?" Alaric considered the question carefully before answering, watching afternoon sunlight filter gently through the churchyard's old trees, casting dappled shadows across the newly placed memorial stone. "I believe I do," he said finally, "though I confess I never anticipated, when I first found that portrait buried in the snow, how completely the search for her story would come to matter to me personally. I expected perhaps a brief curiosity satisfied within a few days of modest investigation. Instead, I found myself drawn into understanding an entire life, a courage that history had nearly succeeded in erasing entirely." Peter nodded thoughtfully. "Do you believe such efforts are always worthwhile?" he asked, "even when they lead ultimately towards sorrow rather than the happier resolution we might have hoped to discover?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment, considering this question with genuine seriousness rather than offering a quick or easy answer. "I believe truth itself carries inherent value," he said finally, regardless of whether that truth ultimately proves comfortable or difficult to accept. Elspeth Vane deserved to be remembered accurately, whatever her final fate turned out to be. Leaving her forgotten, reduced merely to rumor and speculation, would have been a far greater tragedy than confirming that her courageous attempt at freedom ultimately ended in loss rather than triumph. The portrait itself, following the memorial's dedication, returned to Thornwood Hall, where Alaric arranged for it to be displayed prominently within his study, rather than relegated to the long gallery alongside his own family's more conventional ancestral portraits. He commissioned a small brass plaque to be affixed beneath the frame, briefly explaining Elspeth's true identity and the remarkable circumstances of her portrait's eventual discovery, and the subsequent uncovering of her complete story. Visitors to Thornwood Hall in the years that followed often found themselves drawn to this particular painting, curious about the unusual plaque and the brief, but compelling summary of events it provided. Alaric never tired of sharing the fuller story with those who expressed genuine interest, recognizing that each retelling served, in its own small way, to further ensure that Elspeth's memory would continue extending forward through time, rather than fading once more into the kind of comfortable obscurity that had nearly claimed her story completely before that fateful winter morning, when his own horse had startled at something buried unexpectedly beneath the snow. As the years passed, Alaric occasionally found himself returning to that same stretch of forest road along Thornwood's northern boundary, particularly during winter months when fresh snow blanketed the landscape much as it had on that original morning of discovery. He never found anything further of significance during these visits, no additional hidden treasures or forgotten secrets waiting to be uncovered. Yet he found something quietly meaningful in simply standing at that particular location, remembering the remarkable journey that had begun there, a journey that had ultimately taught him far more about courage, sacrifice, and the enduring importance of truth than he could ever have anticipated when he first knelt in the snow, brushing away frost to reveal a stranger's sorrowful painted face looking back at him across a distance of many generations. Elspeth Vane's story, once nearly lost entirely to time and circumstance, had finally found its rightful place within the historical record of 3 counties her courageous final journey had briefly connected. And Duke Alaric Thornwood, who had once been merely a practical man with little patience for sentiment or superstition, found himself forever changed by the experience, carrying forward a deeper appreciation for the countless untold stories that likely remained hidden throughout the countryside surrounding his own estate, waiting patiently, as Elspeth's story had waited, for someone with sufficient curiosity and determination to finally bring them properly into the light. Nearly 2 years after the memorial's dedication, a letter arrived at Thornwood Hall bearing a postmark from a distant northern county Alaric had never personally visited, addressed simply to the Duke known for uncovering the story of a woman named Elspeth Vane. Harold brought the letter to his study with obvious curiosity, having heard enough of the original story over the preceding months to recognize its potential significance. Alaric opened the letter carefully, his interest immediately piqued by the unfamiliar handwriting and the mention, within the opening lines, of a family surname he recognized instantly from Elspeth's own recovered letter, the very family the traveling painter had once promised would help her establish a new life far from Hallowdene. The letter was written by a woman named Charlotte, no relation to the innkeeper Alaric had previously encountered in Hallowdene, but rather a descendant of the painter's own distant relatives, the family Elspeth had been traveling toward on that final fateful winter journey so many generations earlier. Charlotte explained that news of Alaric's discovery had eventually reached her own family through the gradually spreading accounts of Elspeth's story, and that this news had prompted her to search through her own family's old papers, hoping to find any connection that might add further detail to the remarkable history Alaric had worked so diligently to uncover. What she found, according to the letter, proved remarkable in its own right. Among her family's preserved correspondence, carefully maintained across multiple generations, existed several old letters written by her own ancestor, a woman named Margaret, describing her anticipation of a young stranger's arrival during a particularly harsh winter many decades earlier, a young woman she had never personally met, but had agreed to help based entirely on her own son's earlier promise and description of a courageous woman fleeing an unwanted arranged marriage. Charlotte included, within her own letter, careful transcriptions of these old family documents, allowing Alaric to read Margaret's own words describing the preparations she had made in anticipation of Elspeth's arrival. A small room had been prepared within Margaret's own modest household, simple but warm, intended to provide safe refuge, until Elspeth could establish herself independently within the local community, perhaps eventually finding suitable employment or even remarriage under a carefully constructed new identity that would protect her from any future discovery by her original family. I waited 3 full months past the expected date of her arrival, Margaret had written, in a passage that struck Alaric with particular emotional force. Each day, I told myself that perhaps the winter weather had simply delayed her journey longer than anticipated, that she would arrive eventually, tired and cold, but ultimately safe, ready to begin the new life we had promised to help her build. But as the months passed without any word or sign of her arrival, I gradually came to accept that something terrible must have befallen her during her journey, though I never learned with certainty what fate she ultimately encountered. Margaret's letters continued for several more years afterward, according to Charlotte's careful research, occasionally mentioning the small prepared room that she apparently never repurposed for other uses, keeping it ready and waiting for a guest who would never arrive. A quiet, private memorial maintained privately within her own household long after any realistic hope of Elspeth's eventual arrival had faded entirely. Alaric found himself deeply moved reading these transcribed passages, recognizing how far the ripples of Elspeth's courageous decision had ultimately traveled, touching the lives of people she had never even met personally, people who had nonetheless prepared to welcome her with genuine kindness and generosity, based entirely on second-hand accounts of her character and circumstances. Margaret, it seemed, had understood something important about Elspeth's story even without ever meeting her directly, recognizing the courage inherent in her decision, and choosing to honor that courage through her own quiet, patient preparation, regardless of whether her efforts were ultimately rewarded with success. Charlotte's letter concluded with an invitation, extending an offer for Alaric to visit her own family's estate should his travels ever bring him to the northern counties. Expressing genuine interest in learning more directly about the fuller circumstances Alaric had uncovered regarding Elspeth's final journey, while also offering to share whatever additional family records might exist that could further illuminate this now shared history connecting their two distant families across so many generations. Alaric accepted this invitation eagerly, making arrangements to travel north later that same year. Once summer had fully settled over the countryside and travel conditions had improved considerably compared to the harsh winter journey he had originally undertaken. Peter, now more accustomed to accompanying his employer on such unusual expeditions, joined him once again for this final chapter of the remarkable story that had begun so unexpectedly with a startled horse and a portrait buried in the snow. The journey north proved considerably easier during the warmer months, the countryside displaying entirely different qualities than the harsh winter landscape Alaric remembered from his original search. Rolling fields stretched green and vibrant beneath clear summer skies, and the roads, free from ice and heavy snow, allowed for considerably faster and more comfortable travel than the difficult conditions that had originally slowed his earlier journey through Rosemere, Ashcombe, and Hallowdene. Charlotte welcomed them warmly upon their arrival, proving to be a thoughtful and genuinely curious woman roughly Alaric's own age, eager to share her family's preserved history while also expressing sincere interest in learning the fuller details of everything Alaric had personally uncovered during his own extensive investigation months earlier. She showed him, during their visit, the small room Margaret had once prepared for Elspeth's anticipated arrival, still preserved within the family's current household, though now used occasionally for storage rather than maintained specifically as a memorial. Standing within that quiet, modest space, Alaric felt a profound sense of connection to the entire story, recognizing how this small room represented, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of hope and kindness that Elspeth had been seeking during her desperate winter journey, hope and kindness that had indeed awaited her, tragically just beyond her final reach. She was so close to finding exactly what she sought, Alaric said quietly, standing within the small preserved room alongside Charlotte and Peter. A place of genuine welcome and safety, prepared specifically for her by people who believed in her courage, even without knowing her personally. It seems almost unbearably cruel that harsh weather prevented her from ever experiencing that welcome herself. Charlotte nodded slowly, her own expression reflecting similar sorrow mixed with quiet appreciation for finally understanding this fuller context surrounding her own family's preserved history. Perhaps, she offered gently, there is some small comfort in knowing that her courage was recognized and honored, even if she never lived to experience that recognition personally. Margaret believed in her enough to prepare this room and maintain it faithfully for years afterward. That belief itself represents something meaningful, regardless of the ultimately tragic outcome. Before departing from Charlotte's estate several days later, Alaric proposed an idea that had been forming gradually throughout his visit, suggesting that perhaps a small plaque might be added within this preserved room as well, connecting it formally to the memorial already established within Hallodean's churchyard, ensuring that both locations, so many miles apart yet connected through Elspeth's courageous final journey, would properly commemorate the full scope of her remarkable story. Charlotte agreed enthusiastically to this proposal, and arrangements were made before Alaric's eventual departure to have Edward, the same skilled stonemason who had crafted the original memorial, travel north later that year to complete this additional commemorative work, ensuring consistency and appropriate craftsmanship across both memorial locations. As Alaric and Peter finally began their journey back toward Thornwood, having spent nearly 2 full weeks exploring this final unexpected chapter of Elspeth's remarkable story, Alaric found himself reflecting once more on how completely this entire experience had reshaped his own understanding of history, courage, and the enduring importance of preserving truth even when that truth arrived incomplete, scattered across multiple counties and multiple generations, requiring patient, dedicated effort to finally assemble into something resembling a complete and coherent whole. "Do you think this is truly the end of her story now, Your Grace?" Peter asked as they traveled the final stretch of road leading back toward Thornwood's familiar boundaries. "Or do you suspect further details might yet emerge, connecting to still more distant places and people we have not yet encountered?" Alaric considered this question thoughtfully, watching the familiar countryside gradually unfold around them as they drew nearer to home. "I suspect," he said finally, "that every story, however completely told, likely contains further threads extending beyond what we manage to uncover within any single investigation. But I believe we have honored Elspeth's memory as fully and faithfully as circumstances allow, and that feels, to me, like a genuinely meaningful conclusion, even if some smaller details might yet remain forever beyond our reach." Peter nodded in agreement, and the two men continued their journey in comfortable silence, the summer sun warm upon their shoulders, very different from the harsh winter cold that had originally accompanied Alaric's first tentative steps into this remarkable and unexpected journey. Behind them, across 3 counties now permanently connected through Elspeth Vane's courageous story, 2 carefully crafted memorials stood as lasting testament to a woman whose brief, difficult life had ultimately proven far more significant and inspiring than anyone, including Elspeth herself perhaps, could have fully anticipated during those desperate final days of her extraordinary winter journey toward freedom.